So, everybody, welcome to Love at First Science, and a big, warm welcome to Diana Florio, who's going to be discussing the core with us today from her vast knowledge as a physiotherapist. Diana, welcome.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here, Celeste.
Oh, my love. Listen, we were just fangirling over each other just before the show because you came into my life off the back of me talking about the core, and you were like, look at this post I made. And as soon as I laid eyes on you describing the core with so much elegance and in a way that is so easy to digest, I was instantly replied to you going, please, can you be on my podcast talking about the core? Because I was also saying to you before we started recording, it's a bit of a lonely journey currently, I feel, talking about the core in this capacity, because there's not a lot of people saying that it needs to move along with the breath. But the rigid state is still very much the message that's out there. Before we get into all of that, can you please introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us your story?
Sure thing. Yes. And you mentioned so many great points. I agree that it's a lonely state, but when when we're in this silo where we're following all these great other people like Julie Weeb and all these other smart physios, it doesn't feel siloed. So I'm glad that we're doing this together. My name is Diana. I am a mom of three. I run a business called Threes PhysioYoga. We are a team of physical therapists and yoga teachers. We do yoga teacher training. We have online content and videos and online studio. I'm a trained physical therapist, and I have a strong musculoskeletal, orthopedic, and sports medicine base. And I love all things neuroscience. I love deep dives into research, and I also practice and treat patients while teaching. So I kind of do a bit of everything to keep my head in the game on all parts.
I'm so happy that you gave us that kind of little synopsis, because I think one of the criticisms of the message that has come directed towards me is that I don't see patients regularly. I have got some patients, but really a small cohort. So when I realized that this was an issue for people listening to me talk about the core in the capacity that I have been, I was like, okay, I'm going to get the smartest people who see the most amount of people. And I got some really, really cool people. But what I love about you, Diana, is that, yes, you see the patients, but you also have the strong tie to yoga. So before we kind of get into all the various things that we've discussed at length already on this podcast, but I think you've got quite a nice, unique take on it, which is why I wanted to bring you on the show. Can we just discuss a little bit about what's happening, particularly in the yoga world, that you're like, ooh, interesting. Maybe this and this needs to develop.
Sure. I think one of the things I'm seeing most often is that people are really having a hard time trying to understand how and when they should cue the core. I think there's a certain fact of yoga teachers who are still cueing the core globally. So if you're in a yoga class, if you're moving through Warrior 2 to Ardha Chandrasana to a plank, there's this sort of universal language of just engage your core, tighten your core, squeeze your abdominals. And I think from a physical therapist perspective, it's hard to swallow because we know that the core is such an integrated system where a one size fits all cue isn't really going to fit the specific task demands. It's not like your bicep or even your glute max, where you're like, okay, engage that muscle to produce a specific action, elbow flexion or hip extension. It's more like when we want to engage that core, what are we actually trying to get out of it? What's the desired action? Is it stability? Is it mobility? Is it energy transfer? And so I think for us, one of the things we struggle with is sort of debunking that, not that myth, but that myth, that sort of underlying pretense that core needs to be rigid and strong throughout the entire yoga class, and that we need to be engaging in all positions 10 out of 10 at all times. So it's trying to break down that into something that's much more usable and almost individual to the pose, to the action, and to the person, what that core is doing during the course of a yoga class. And it's complicated. It's way more difficult to teach something like that in the core in a nuanced way in a yoga class than just give a blanket cue to engage your core. It's way more difficult, but it's also way more rich for the student experience and way more healthy.
Yeah, it's so important. We're obviously going to get into practical tips, I think, a bit later towards the end of the show. So please, guys, stick around for those, especially if you're a yoga teacher or a Pilates teacher. I think we need to start talking to the Pilates community, especially. They've also only been given very limited strategies around core. But a question that comes to me quite often, and in all honesty, I had to check in with a few different physios to find out their opinions before I was willing to state mine. Plank position. What's the deal there?
Sure. What is the deal there? I think everyone's going to do a plank position differently. Number one, the way I do a plank is going to be different from the way you do a plank. The way, how much effort I put into my arms and my legs is going to be different. What I do with my core is going to be different. That's so individualistic. I kind of give this idea of this corometer, right? It's a scale. Your core can engage at a 0, right? I'm probably engaging at like a 1 or a 2 right now as I sit in my chair. My brain is receiving the message that I don't need to do a whole lot of effort to keep my spine upright. So my core is engaging a 1 or a 2. If I was to stand up, it might ramp up a little bit because now I'm against gravity a bit more. My trunk muscles and my core have to hold me upright. When I'm in a plank, it's the same. When I'm in that horizontal position, the corometer is going to tick up a bit, maybe like a 5 or a 6, so that my spine can hold itself in the position I choose, right? It's not necessarily a position that I know, but maybe I'm like trying to strive for my neutral, or I'm trying to strive for more of a posterior pelvic tilt and take away some lumbar lordosis. I think it really matters what you're really trying to achieve in that position. I often tell people to engage at the level that they feel like they can to support themselves to feel strong, but also to feel like they can sense energy traveling from their quads, from their glutes, through their core, into the rib cage, into the scapula, so that my shoulders aren't doing 10 out of 10 of the work, but the load, the work of holding my body up is moving energetically from my feet to my head, to my head to my feet. And the core is that vital energy transfer system that links the pelvic girdle, the pelvis and ribs, to the shoulder scapular girdle. So I don't think it's a 10 out of 10 when you're in plank. However, if I was doing a plank and my 3-year-old jumped on my back, up goes the corometer, 8, 9, 10 out of 10, so that I don't sink into extension, start to hinge at my back and my spine. So those are my thoughts about plank. I think you can waste a lot of energy being in a plank holding a 10 out of 10 core contraction. That's the yoga class you'll see my husband in, where he's sweating bullets because he thinks he's in the NFL combine competing. It's like we can be really efficient by doing less, by connecting the whole body from the heels to the crown of the head through the core. We could do less work. And sometimes less is more.
And do you think that there is movement along with the pressure system, or is that a bit more challenging in plank and therefore the movement will be less? What's your thoughts?
I think you can play with it. I don't think it's a one-stop shop, right? I think it's harder to do a lot of diaphragm and pelvic floor excursion in a plank. It will feel like you won't get that full range of motion you may if you're sitting. But I think you could play with it if you wanted to. If you were really efficient through your scapular girdle and your legs, and you could sort of let some of the rigidity of the core, right? Some of the stiffness go so that you could facilitate a little bit of excursion, I think you could. I think it really depends on how the rest of the body is picking it up.
I'm just absolutely loving the way you're explaining things. You're so eloquent in the way you link all the systems. Could it be, I'm really going off piece now, but could it be that someone has less effective use of their pelvic girdle and their shoulder girdle because they're overusing their core? That question just popped into my head. I don't know if it has any legs, for lack of a better phrase.
Totally. I totally get your phrase. I wonder though, because maybe, right, especially if you're gripping so hard that you're putting yourself in a little bit of spinal flexion, right, or like rigidity, then you could change what's happening at the scapula and the relationship between the scapula and the thorax. And so we have specific length tension relationships that we look for out of the mid-traps and rhomboids and lats and serratus. And so if we're in this rounded position all the time, those muscles, they may have a more difficult time producing the most efficient contraction. So maybe, I mean, that's one possible thing. But I wonder if you're standing and you're doing like overhead presses and you're gripping your core 10 out of 10, can that affect what's happening too with the shoulders, right? Could that make the way that your scapula move a little bit less fluid, a little bit more rigid, right? And so
it's all connected, right?
I mean, if your scapula can't do what it needs to do because you're gripping 10 out of 10 in your core, then totally. I feel like I see that less though, but now I'm gonna see it more because you said it.
It's so funny when someone mentions something and then you just start seeing it everywhere. That happens with us physios all the time.
All the time.
I mean, for a long time, I was teaching to take a plank in a very rounded position. And I guess the thinking around it was serratus is going to get a bit more activation. And, then it's going to be much harder to kind of drop down into my core because as my rib cage goes into that kyphotic position, my core reflexively has to go along with it. And then I started looking at some content from people that were saying, a neutral position is great because it's actually going to then translate into standing. And that's ultimately why you're doing plank. And then I was thinking, whoa, that like really got me to think far more deeply about, I don't know why I'm fixated on plank today, but I think it's because I get so many questions about plank. Can we get your opinion on this as well, please?
Oh, this is so exciting. Okay, so part of my brain is like variety. Yeah, like train all the planks, train them all, train them in posterior tilt, anterior tilt, rounded spine, extended thoracic spine, even get hands on blocks, one hand on block, side bends, whatever. But if we're striving for plank to get an efficient core, then neutral is the way to go. And here's why. It all has to do with the 3 diaphragms. Okay, so when we have adaptable neuroconnected feedback to up and down, increase or decrease the pressure in our core, then we're highly efficient in producing the right amount of pressure to protect the internal organs and the spine for the task at hand, which translates to the least amount of effort in the muscles of the core to create protection and stability in the spine. How do we achieve that? We have to stack the bones that correlate to those 3 diaphragms so that we get a reflexive system. The bones involved are the skull, the rib cage, and the pelvis. The skull, because the glottis, it's our top pressure valve, right? Those 2 vocal cords open and close. The rib cage holds and houses the respiratory diaphragm, which descends on inhale, ascends on exhale. And the pelvic floor does that very synchronous movement when it descends and ascends. Those 3 different parts up and down regulate how much pressure is inside the core. The more pressure, think of it like a soda can. The more pressure, it can become very rigid, and the wall of our 360 degrees of the wall of our trunk are rigid. They're withstanding forces, translation, the kid jumping on our back. That's good. When we have the head stacked over the neutral rib cage, stacked over the neutral pelvis, all of the different diaphragms are aligned on top of the other, meaning it takes the least amount of effort for them to contain the pressure. If our rib cage is tilted upward into an anterior tilt, now the diaphragm isn't horizontally aligned over the pelvic floor, and it's much harder to regulate that top valve of the diaphragm. Similarly, if we're in an anterior pelvic tilt, same thing. It's much harder for that pelvic floor to close to keep the pressure inside. So we always want to have some sort of neutral alignment to maintain the most ease and efficiency of core control. What we say in Threes is head over lampshade over bowl. So in any plane though, right? Not just vertical. It could be in a warrior two, it could be in a side bend. It could be in a plank. So you want your head stacked over the lampshade of your rib cage, and picture there's a light shining down. The rib cage is your lampshade, and there's a light shining down into the bowl of your pelvis. So you always want that light shining into the bowl, and you want the bowl tilted so that it's receiving the light. Does that make sense?
Totally. I'm loving that metaphor. It's so clear. And I'm like nodding profusely while you're talking, because I'm like, I think it's just because it's my way of absorbing what you're saying. I'm like,
Yeah.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah. So, I mean, there's this idea that like alignment doesn't matter, and throw all the alignment out and get all crazy with variety. And yes to variety, but also yes to alignment. It's there for a reason. It really is. It's important.
I think that especially when you go back to that question, why are you doing what you're doing? And I think that can give you so much, because I look at the people who are in a chair all day, and they might change their body position vastly from sitting to going rock climbing. But if you have to look at their macro body change, it is changing from sitting to rock climbing, but micro body changes aren't happening. In fact, they'll be climbing on a climbing wall, but they're still in the chair, proverbially, because
Absolutely.
they've still got those same patterns, and they're just climbing with the I call it the chair body, and they glued like a barnacle onto the wall. And it's just fascinating that adaptation has gone with them. So I think if that person is presenting with some issues, it could be helpful. It's not necessarily the cause of their pain, but it could be helpful to explore that. So totally, I think that is such a beautiful thing. Head over lampshade over bowl. I'm definitely going to be using that one, my love. But can we talk a little bit about the teachers who champion the 30% engagement? We must always have the 30, no more than 30%. Because I think that's quite hard for people to know even what a 30% is.
Yeah. I think, when did that come about? I think there was a study, right, that said that when we're sitting or standing, they did like a TVA EMG, a transverse abdominis EMG measurement that said that 3 out of 10, I remember learning that in physical therapy school, that it should be a 30% low level engagement. Yeah, what does that mean? How do I know if I'm doing my own 30%? My own 30% is not going to be the same as your 30%. I've had 3 kids. Somebody may have had an abdominal surgery. Things really get changed. I think it's a nice level to think about, though, because it's not 100%, right? And that's better. So the challenging thing about 3 out of 10 is, how do I know what 3 out of 10 is? One of the practical strategies I advocate for is workshopping, understanding what the core is and how to find it in your own body before teaching a yoga class. And so that could take 5 minutes, that could take 10 minutes, but imagine you're a student in a yoga class who has no idea what your core is, and your teacher is telling you to engage at 30% in your warrior two, in your forward fold, in your handstand, and you're just kind of confused throughout that process. You're not sure if you're doing it, you're questioning yourself, and maybe even stressing yourself out by thinking about those things. So 3 out of 10 is going to be totally individual, right? I think if you did an EMG on my 3 out of 10, it would be different than your 3 out of 10. So we have to think about, how can we teach people their own relative core? Because my relative core is going to be different. So teach everybody how to understand what their 0 is, what their 3 is, what their 6 is, what their 9 is, what their 10 is. And you could do this in simple ways. One thing we do is we teach a pelvic clock, and we use the pelvic clock just to help people find neutral. So that, maybe if there's a clock face on your pelvis and 6 o'clock is pubic bone, 12 o'clock is navel, finding between 6 and 12 what tilt feels like you have the least amount of tone in your erector spinae and your hip flexors, and seeing maybe that's your neutral. And then layering on a core contraction over that. Maybe we play with layering on the smallest core contraction you can do, and then up to 3 out of 10, and then up to 6 and to 9. So create these reference points in the person's mind-body interaction. You say, okay, engage 3 out of 10. What does that feel like? What kind of tone do you feel in your lower abdominals? What kind of tone do you feel like in your upper abdominals? What do you feel in your lower back? What's happening in your hips? Are your glutes squeezing? What's your breath doing? What's your neck doing? What are your eyes doing? Reflect on all of that. So you start to use interoception to make a experience. You can even use proprioception, hands to body. And then do that for each level so that people start to landmark their numbers. They're 3, they're 6, they're 9, they're 10. And then you could use that as a reference point. Okay, guys, we're all in now. Like we all learned that together. Now we're going to flow through class. We're going to use that as a key. And you could vary the numbers you would like to call out during your poses to reflect what you've workshopped in the beginning of class. And like I said, it's all going to be different. And I think you kind of also have to let go, like people are going to do it differently. They're going to have different strategies. People who have had injuries or babies, it might be different. But sometimes that's okay, especially if you're providing them with an interoceptive experience. They're getting in tune with their body. It's the first step. And maybe if they need more, then they come talk to you after class and they're confused. And then you say, we can do a private session, or maybe you need to see a physical therapist. But it just opens up a different conversation where the core becomes something they get to own and understand instead of just try to figure out during the course of a interesting flow class.
But Diana, do you feel that potentially us giving, I think that's really good, especially if someone hasn't got an understanding of their core. That's going to give them a bit more of an experience. Is there any, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to get away from is really to disrupt the pressure system. I feel like up until now, the strategies that we've been given is to engage these different levels, but I'm not seeing in people the movement of their core at all. They just up here with their breath, their pelvic floor hasn't got that excursion that you were talking about. And is there a danger that potentially us giving them these, guidelines of different numbers to hit, that they're not allowing their TVA to move along with the diaphragm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you can sort of solve that or workshop that by teaching them like a jellyfish breath, where you're getting them to sort of meditate on the movement of the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, where they can start to sense and feel that. I think that's ultimately the only way we can do it, is to really give that education and teach them how to do it on their own, and then come back again to their awareness and feeling if that's moving. And I think the check-in points need to be not just when you're on the mat, but when you're waiting in line at the grocery store, or waiting or holding your child, or doing your dishes, or sitting on your chair doing work. Like, can you check in on the pelvic floor? Are you, now we're all checking in, but are you gripping?
Yeah.
Right? So I like to teach a jellyfish meditation where we're just sort of sitting, and I like to do it kneeling over a bolster, build the bolster up as much as you can so it's right up in the pelvic floor, so you get that tactile feedback. And sometimes we do a TheraBand, a loose TheraBand around the rib cage and rib cage expansion. Visualize the 2 or 3 holes of the pelvic floor widening on inhale, narrowing on exhale, or you can use bony landmarks. But you have to just try on different cues and try to get people to, yeah.
It's so good. It's so good that, yeah, there's definitely so much to it. Because I think one of the things, I know you and I were talking about it before I hit record, was the fact that there is so many systems that the diaphragm hits. And I guess the thing that I was observing happening around me is that people were cueing the core, 30% core engagement for the whole class, let's say, and they were kind of gripping in their TVA. Their diaphragm was not the diaphragmatic excursion wasn't happening. And I was like, how many systems is that hitting? And then when you talk to these people, they're like, yeah, I suffer with anxiety, and oh, I've had constipation for 3 weeks, and oh, I've got hormonal issues, that I'm dealing with. And I'm thinking, maybe it's because you're engaging your core a little too much. And I'm not suggesting causation, but I'm definitely, there is an interrelationship there. Can you give us maybe a little bit of insight into some of the systems that you think we need to be mindful of around core engagement?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of them. I think we have to be very mindful and respect that pump that occurs between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. So I think one of the things we have to do as a profession of physios, movement teachers, is say, just stop calling the core a group of muscles in a region of the body and call it a very integrated system. It's not like our bicep, it's not like our upper arm. It's not just muscles and bones. It's there to protect all of our digestive organs, all of our sexual organs, urogenital, bowel, bladder. And that diaphragm has that huge interaction with our parasympathetic response. And so all of the, and I mean, then you can think up and down the chain, right? So if we're gripping too rigidly, we can also affect what's happening in our shoulder and our neck. Or if we're gripping our pelvic floor too rigidly, we can affect what's happening in our hip, knee, ankle, foot. So this like understanding of just letting it go and then up regulating and down regulating dependent on the task at hand is really important. And if there's any lesson to learn, it's that there is no one size fits all level of core function. It should change like a million times throughout the day to reflect what you're doing so that you can pump the viscera along with that peristalsis that's going to come from the stimulation of the diaphragm pressing down and up so that all of those abdominal contents are moving. So when your diaphragm descends, you get that vagal tone so that you can rest and digest, so that you aren't gripping so hard in your core where you're really changing what's happening through all of those different sexual organs, erectile dysfunction, ovulation. All of these things have been shown to be affected by what we do with our pelvic floor and our core. Holding your our hypotonic pelvic floor has an influence on the control of urine and the bowels, and it's directly related. And I think that, people don't realize that, and how, if you walked around all day with an abdominal binder on, you would feel quite anxious. You can't breathe. When you're
I get very upset when people promote those abdominal waist toners. I get honestly so triggered. I get triggered when people say engage the core. Can you imagine if they were a bloody waist trainer? It really winds me up. So irresponsible.
Totally. I mean, if you're lifting 900 pounds, maybe you want to strap it on for 1 or 2 power lifts, but know when. Not to fit into a gown. So I mean, there's so much in there, and we have to respect it. We have to let it go, because it is so interrelated with how we function. Your cognition, your ability to get a good night's sleep, your ability to have a nice immune system. This is also related to the parasympathetic system. A nice immune system. You have a highly well-functioning immune system. So, but I also think that people hold their core in because of emotions. Because if we have a lot of, if we think we need to look a certain way, we're going to hold it in. But also if we're tense or anxious, we have a lot of perceived stress. When we go into fight or flight, no matter what the stressor is or our perception of it, it's still causing a fight or flight response. And then when we get a fight or flight response, we get ready to mobilize, and that's muscular tension throughout the body. So it comes from both ways, that emotional component.
Yeah, the emotional component is quite something I had to really experience quite powerfully in my body. I mean, I had multiple reasons. I had terrible guts, not constipated, but just way too much going on from my hypermobility. I don't think, though, that a tight core helped that at all. I think, if anything, with the lack of diaphragmatic excursion just put me out of whack, and I didn't get that vagal stimulation, which meant the levels of anxiety that I was having to work with throughout my lifetime, and just how empowering it's been letting go and just feeling the movement. And even if I mean, now I never think about my core. Now I just let that anticipatory nature of the core do its thing. I trust that my body is strong enough. Unless I was in the gym yesterday and I was doing legs and we were doing a squat and I went the heaviest I'd ever gone. And the trainer was like, you need to do a bit of Valsalva now. And I was like, yeah, now's the time to squeeze my core and hold my breath. And then as soon as he dropped the weight down, I did a back off set where you actually drop the weight significantly and I do loads of reps. I was like, now I'm going to practice getting my core to move on each breath. And I had so much stamina. I couldn't believe how much strength output I had from just, anyway, it's just been mind blowing. I'm going off on a tangent, but just to say, it's not a weakened state to let your core go when you're taking your inhale.
Right. And I am a runner. And I think that that has so much to do too with running, because I think we're told a lot to engage our core with running, but it's not helpful. It's wasted energy. Yeah. It's not allowing the diaphragm to descend on inhale, which is so important to get that efficient breath. And when I let my core go and trust that it's going to do, but I do stack my lampshade over my bowl, then I don't pee in my pants when I'm running and I'm breathing well.
And you've had 3 kids.
Running forever. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's just say that this is not
yeah, I know.
This is,
I know.
No, just because a lot of times people are like, oh, but you don't know. No, I don't. I haven't had kids. I don't know. But I mean, here you are with all your wisdom as a physio and you've had 3 babies.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's still a struggle because if I don't stack my head over a lampshade or a bowl, and I'm doing like a rib flare, it can happen. Like if my bladder is full, it can happen because that system needs to be stacked to move well and support the bladder organ with the core. Yeah.
Diana, I get the question all the time, yoga teachers writing to me going, I'm confused. What am I supposed to say in class? And I think you've already given us quite a few practical tips, but can we just kind of either recap or add to that list a little bit? Because I think that yoga teachers have been, well, all of us really since teenagers, the only strategy we've ever been given is to engage. And now people like you and me are out there going, oh, by the way, constantly squeezing the middle is not the most effective thing. And people are just at a loss. They are looking at me going, well, I've got people in my class that are really weak. They've got no connection to the middle of their body. What is it that I'm supposed to say now? Like, are you just causing trouble for the sake of it? And I'm like, no, I'm not causing trouble. I really want to empower people, especially teachers, because they are in contact with so many people. So if we can get the teachers empowered, I think, we help many, many more.
Yeah. I come from this from like a physical therapist standpoint, firstly, which is, people who have a hard time contracting their middle. Sometimes it's been years that it's been like that. And it can be really hard to just fire off a cue to get them to be able to do it. You may say engage their core, and all of a sudden you see their upper traps engage and their shoulders fly up toward their skull. So that's not a helpful cue. I think other cues that we could use in the midst of class could reflect more about energetics, almost. Like if you're in a plank, could you imagine that you're moving energy through the midsection as you lengthen your head away from your heel? If you're standing, same thing. Can you think about potentially like lifting the rib cage off of the pelvis, pressing down through your feet to get an energetic idea? Or could you feel more connected as a whole? Can you feel the energy move from the pelvis through the shoulders? You use energetic cues. I think my favorite thing to do is workshop it in the beginning. If you're going to be addressing it in class, breaking it down into simple pieces so people can get a little bit of insight into what it feels like to engage. If they're really trying to get people to do a little bit more engagement, get a little bit more insight to engage. And maybe one class you teach levels of engagement, one class you teach jellyfish breath, and you start to empower your students with an ownership of what their core should be doing and what it should feel like. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had students come to me after a yoga class, or patients come to me and say, I've taken all these Pilates classes, I've taken all these yoga classes, we've done things with bands, we've done things with foam rollers, we've done things with balls. I still don't feel it. I'm not sore after in my core. My core does not turn on. So I think taking the time to really break it down into simple pelvic clocks, dialing it up, dialing it down, doing jellyfish breath can help. I use all the traditional cues, try to gently knit your rib cage, pull your lower abdominals away from your underpants, brace like a child is going to jump on you, brace like a cat's going to jump on you, different weighted animals and people. But yeah, I think it comes down to the fundamentals of just teaching people to own it, because it's so complicated. It's not like you can just say like, squeeze your butt, because sometimes, there's no just squeeze your butt for the core, I don't think.
There really isn't. And I think that, like I've been saying, that has been our only strategy for so long. And so it's great to talk to people like you with more knowledge. And I think that one of the things that I've been doing since I came into the yoga world was like, how can we bring more of the physios into the arena of yoga so that we actually have some solid foundations? Because there have been a lot of sort of Chinese whispers in the world of anatomical yoga speech, where they're like, you're doing XYZ for this and this reason. And I'd stand there thinking, what are they going on about? This is just so random what people are saying.
Yes.
And then I remember being in a class and this one guy went up to the teacher and he was like, I got a bit of a funny feeling in my rib when I was twisting. And, there was this great speech that went on about emotion. And she's right, there is emotional aspect to it. But, there's also other layers that are fairly easy to target, like maybe the way you were breathing, or an intercostal, or maybe it was a nerve feeding through there. And so, I just wanted the marriage of the spiritual and the physical to come together, and then they could help each other become better. I don't think that physio is perfect. I think we needed the yoga to kind of come into the physio. So I love your brand, the way you kind of married them up. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where people can find out more about you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So my business partners and I, we're all physios and we're also yoga teachers. And we came into creating our 100-hour advanced teacher training first. And so what we wanted to do is teach a systems-based approach, integrating the physical therapy and the nervous system science into how we look and interact with bodies on and off the mat. So we just bring in all of this physical therapy science in terms of, we layer on like the joint mechanics, the biomechanics, the kinesiology, the physiology, but also the emotional, how to do, we do a functional movement assessment based in asana. We do a lot of talking about how to create space to speak with people and how to guide people to have those conversations at the end of class that are more educated, that can offer people ideas of how to maybe make some modifications or pose options, regress and progress poses using movement principles like gravity, load, proprioception, stability. And we kind of tackle all the areas of the body, including the nervous system science. We also integrate a biopsychosocial spiritual aspect where we teach an assessment through that lens. And
basically, you do a lot.
Yeah, we do a lot. That's our 100-hour teacher training.
That's
I know.
Fantastic. It's so like holistic in the approach. I think that's why I like it.
Yeah.
It's incredibly holistic. So beautiful what you're doing. I hope everybody follows you.
Thank you.
It's Threes PhysioYoga, guys.
Yes, that's it.
Please. Yeah, I just think what you guys are doing is so cool. A very practical, very easy to grasp. And I just wanted to say thank you because you eloquently describe things in a beautiful way that I think is going to be very empowering for people as they watch this. And just keep doing what you're doing. It's so great to see. But just before we sign off, I actually ask everyone this question. And that is, if you had a message for the world that has nothing to do with core, if you can, if you want, or if you could just say one thing to everybody on earth, what would your one message be?
Wow. I think it has to do with kind of like how I raise my kids. And that's all I keep coming back to. My mentality when I raise my kids is maybe be average or a little bit above average, but be kind and respectful and do good for the world. That's all I want for my children.
It's so beautiful, my love. What an amazing mother and leader. I'm sure that all of the people who graduate from your systems walk out of that better people for messages like that. So Thank you so much for being here with me today. And for all the listeners that are out there listening to Diana, please do give her a follow on Threes PhysioYoga and check out her awesome content. And thank you for listening, guys. And thank you for being along with us on this journey. I know it's new information and it's sometimes hard to implement these things.
And I just, thank you for this.
Oh,
Thank
it's a
you.
huge privilege and a huge honor. Goodbye, my loves. Thank you for listening.